So to recap, last week we finished Paul's epistles or letters to churches, large
Mhm.
groups of Christians. This week I'm going over the next four books of the New Testament. So we left off with Second Thessalonians, and the books that come next, if you turn in your Bible, it'll rock on over to First Timothy, Second Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. And those are Paul's letters to just single people, to individuals, one guy. So he's got four of these, and those are just the four I'm going to go over today. The same format. You're hearing Lyra.
Yeah.
That's my 2-year-old daughter. So same format. I'll go over who wrote them, when, and kind of a little summary of each one, and kind of what people's general thoughts are about why they think what they think about who wrote it and when.
Sure.
So the first thing I guess I should say is First Timothy, Second Timothy, and Titus are treated a bit kind of like one subject. They sort of all fall and stand together. Perhaps they're written very much at the same time. They're very similar. Whereas Philemon, although it is a letter to an individual, it's kind of totally different in character, written at a different time. The disputes about it are completely different. So these first three are all sort of interlinked, and so, obviously, First and Second Timothy even more so. They're written to the same guy, to this guy named Timothy.
Yeah.
So, First and Second Timothy are both signed by Paul. They say they're written by Paul, and they say they're written to this guy named Timothy. And they're both very similar. But I'll start with First Timothy. He starts with just a brief, again, what you call like a Christology, just a fancy word for he gives a brief teaching on who Jesus is, what his nature is, teaching about Jesus specifically, about his nature. And kind of in that, he presents what we call like the gospel, the good news about who Jesus is. But and another thing, all four of these I'm going over today, they're super short. They're very, very short, very short. So, even though I got 3 points here that I'll give in a summary, they go by quick because these are real tiny little letters. So after that, he just gives lots of practical commands about how to structure a church. What are the qualifications for church leaders? How should they be teaching? How can they avoid teaching in a prideful manner? Things like that. So it's very much how to run a church, how to be a leader. Timothy seems like he's a leader of a church, and so it's just kind of Paul writing and guiding him in Timothy's leadership there. And then he just ends it with some just kind of encouraging words. So this letter was written probably 61 to 68. And we'll talk a little bit more after Second Timothy about authorship. But we'll just say for now, written by Paul. And we'll get in a little bit more after Second Timothy here about dating and authorship. But so Second Timothy is another letter to this same guy, Timothy. And it's very similar. Again, you're getting a lot of practical commands on how to be a church leader, things like that. A little bit more so, you're getting encouragement from Paul to Timothy about evangelizing, sharing the news about Jesus, and enduring suffering for the sake of that message, because there's some persecutions happening and things like that. So he's kind of encouraging him, telling him, stick with it and things like that. And then not only, like the first one was more so how to teach without being prideful, things like that. And this one, he's sort of how to avoid false teachings. Sort of worried that, well, there's some wrong teachings cropping up and things like that. So how to really cut that out and really keep everyone sort of focused on the core true teachings. And then he gives, interestingly, at the end, Paul just kind of gives an update to Timothy on his own status, on Paul's happenings, and kind of says like, I'm probably going to die soon, is basically what he says, and kind of says that, that's okay. I'm no regrets type of thing. I'm still expresses just joy and everything that's happening in the church, and joy at his ability to have done some of this evangelizing and things like that. But does kind of give him an update and sort of almost like a warning, I'm not going to be around for much longer. So you're, at least without my guidance, probably from here on out type of thing.
Yeah.
So with that, this was probably, again, if this was Paul, this was the last letter we have from him. This is the latest. We saw a while ago, First Thessalonians was maybe first document of Christianity ever. And this Second Timothy was maybe the last thing Paul ever wrote, or at least the last thing we have of his that he ever wrote. So, kind of a heavy thing to read and go, wow, this was his last writing. So it's his latest. If you ever want to think about just kind of timeline and history and where he was at in his life, that's helpful just to have in your head that this was the latest one. So I will say, First Timothy, Second Timothy, and Titus. These three books, and I haven't gotten quite to Titus yet, but I'll just get into some of the controversy. They're so far the most hotly contested books as far as like authenticity goes. I could just tell when I was reading, I could just tell, all the other studies, it was like, yeah, some people think this wasn't Paul, but just most people do think it is, or, it's just so reasonable to think it's Paul. And this one was definitely a little bit more, you could tell there was like just more hesitation in the writings and things and encyclopedias and things, where it was like, well, it's a lot of people think now, well, maybe this wasn't Paul. Now I will say, again, though, overwhelmingly they did all say Paul, and so there is that, but definitely I could just tell as far as how hotly contested these are. So far, this is the most the one has the strongest group of people or scholars saying that maybe it's not. And I would just say there's two reasons for that. And the first one is it just, let's see here, it sounds a little different than Paul. The vocabulary and the terms are a little different. But of course, they're a little the same too. I would say, yeah. Just on a non-Greek, me just reading it, I think, well, it sounds a lot the same, but it is also some different. There's some differences there. And then there's difficulty fitting it in with what we have in Acts. So not difficulty fitting it in, but if these letters were from Paul, then they're documenting something that is not documented in Acts, is probably the best way to put it. And the reason for that is these letters indicate that, so Acts ends with Paul being imprisoned in Rome. And so that's it. We get one imprisonment at Rome, Acts ends. These letters indicate that then he would have had to have been released to go do other stuff and then imprisoned again, because these letters have him imprisoned, but they also
Yeah.
reference things that had to have happened after Acts.
Yeah.
And so those are so people say, well, this stuff wasn't documented in Acts, and it sounds a little different. So that's those are the reasonings. And again, I read that type of stuff and I say, okay, yes, that's possible. But you have to ask, well, what's and the purpose of me giving these types of videos is not to convince anyone that the Bible is all authentic and it's true and things like that. It really isn't. I really don't want it to be like an apologetic type series or anything like that. But just to help people think through, because you look up like a Wikipedia article, and if you just want to do like Paul's writings on Wikipedia, you might come away with a sense like, whoa, there's only like a few of, there's like 8 out of the however many that are genuine. But if you do like a real quick study like this, I mean, take a week. That's all I did. It took a week and look up, 7, not Wikipedia articles, but
Right.
credible encyclopedia articles and things like that you can find online for free or whatever. If you do that, then you get an understanding of why are these disputed, and you can quickly come, oh, there's 2 reasons. It got a little bit of different vocabulary and terms, and it would mean that things happened in Paul's life that weren't recorded in Acts. Okay. And then that, and then you have to decide in your head, or is that enough to sway, because these sort of doubts and, well, maybe it's not Paul, that type of stuff was cropped up in the 19th century. And so, well, is that enough, us thinking about that and kind of realizing that, is that enough to sway, 1800 years of people thinking it's Paul, back to pretty early on. We've got, again, we've got Polycarp accepting, 2 Timothy as Paul. I mean, the letters are written by Paul, and you've got just kind of these things that would be normally reasonable to assume as Paul, and then these doubts, and the doubts are fair and it's possible. That's certainly possible. Oh, maybe, but it would be odd. You just got to kind of think, well, okay, it's written by Paul, and then so if it wasn't him as someone pretending to be him or something like that, and you can just read it and just decide, for yourself, if you think that it's the type of thing someone would fabricate and put the name of a powerful, of a highly respected figure on their letter. Well, if I put Paul on here, then it will be accepted, or what have you. And I suppose I should say, even the people who say, well, maybe it's not Paul, they don't, I guess, necessarily think that, well, it was a total fabrication. They say, well, maybe it was someone being very, very true to Paul, or maybe kind of conglomerating some of Paul's writings and teachings. They don't want to totally dismiss it and say, well, it's not the type of thing that someone would just make up. It doesn't read like that at all. It reads, it's very short. There's just all kinds of practical things in here. At the end is him telling them, make sure, come and visit me before the winter, and then say hi to this person and that person, and those greetings and those things. It's just not that sort of thing that you'd expect there to be flair and teaching, and I'm just going to really come up with this thing and then put someone else's name on it. It just doesn't seem like that at all. And to me, it doesn't. And I just can't imagine that it wasn't Paul, myself, especially not for those reasons. Maybe other reasons were to come to light that might be different, but just because it sounds a little different than him, and that it would mean there's things that happen in his life not recorded in Acts. That's just not enough to sway me. But and I guess that pretty much goes over the first and second Timothy. So on to Titus, and I mentioned Titus flows in with that as well. A lot of that the doubts about it. Titus was, again, to just a single guy named Titus. And again, very, very similar. He's just directing church order, church behavior, telling them, avoid worthless arguments and disputes, which, of course, we've seen Paul do tons and tons of times before. He loves telling people to avoid worthless arguments and disputes. And this is actually a little different, because most of the time he said avoid wrong teaching and don't fall into these traps of wrong beliefs. And this one, he's more so like, just not just they're wrong, there's worthless, they're just arguing about dumb stuff, things that don't matter. I think he mentions genealogies of, let's go back and let's figure out all these family trees and genealogies and all the angels and what they all do and what they all mean, and just stuff like that. He just stopped arguing about that worthless stuff. And so he gets into that, and then at the end he just kind of gives a nice little summary of the faith, is how I worded it. Just kind of a summary of what Christianity is all about. He gives at the end there. So that's to Titus. Reads pretty similar as the first and second Timothy. So like first and second Timothy, it was written somewhere between 61 and 68. So these are all kind of his latter letters in his second imprisonment, his nastier imprisonment, not his house arrest that he ends up getting out of. This is his final imprisonment that he's in here. One source that I read said that this is a good place to go for the Trinitarian doctrine. Just the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. They're all God. They're all separate. That's the Trinitarian doctrine. And someone said this is a good place to go for that. This is a good place where, and I kind of read it and I thought, there's definitely a place there. I think I can't remember where it's at in there, but again, it's a short letter. You can find it quick. But there's definitely a place there where it's Jesus and God are almost used interchangeably. It's he says, God, our only Savior, and then Jesus who saved us, and it's just really I would agree, it's a decent place to go, if you're interested in the Trinitarian doctrine. So Titus is one that's interesting. It has a really good reason for its authenticity, to think that it's Paul. Is that Clement of Rome? He's our earliest guy. Again, he's late 90s. He's our earliest guy outside of the New Testament, who's often we can go to refer to these things, and he calls Titus Paul's epistle. So okay, great. And if Titus is Paul's epistle, then that must mean, well, he did have a second imprisonment, because Titus requires that, and so then that doesn't mean it's an issue for first and second Timothy. And the different vocab are kind of sounding different. I mean, well, these are now letters to individuals. I mean, he's kind of doing something different. They're a totally different feel, writing to a single person than to an entire congregation. So I thought that was great, just to read that Clement of Rome does call Titus Paul's epistles, and of course other early figures are referencing it and acknowledging it as well.
Sure.
So the last of Paul's letters to individuals is this little tiny letter called Philemon. I don't know why I've been so excited to talk about Philemon. If you don't like reading, it should be your favorite book of the whole Bible. I believe it's the shortest book of the Bible. It certainly is the shortest book of the New Testament. And it's the only book of the New Testament without chapters. I'm not sure about the Old Testament. Might be one back there without chapters, but The only book of the New Testament without chapters at all. It's so tiny. All fits on one page, and my Bible is
Yeah.
really tiny.
Yeah.
That's Philemon. There it is.
Yeah. A one pager. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna
And
have, I'll have more of above that, beyond that, with my definition of the gospel.
yeah, there you go. So Philemon is in a kind of a different category. It immediately feels different. Yes, it's to an individual, but he's not writing this letter to talk about how to run a church or how to lead and things like that. He's writing this letter for a very, very specific purpose. In fact, my summary, there's only one point on my summary. It's such a short letter with such a specific purpose. What Paul's doing with this letter is he's writing to this guy named Philemon, requesting that Philemon's release his slave. He's got this guy named Onesimus, and Paul is encouraging Philemon to let this guy go. And the reason being because Onesimus has given his life to Christ. So they're all over in the New Testament. You get this teaching that, I mean, we're all brothers and sisters. We are all sons and daughters of God. If the Spirit is living in us, if we made that, if we've had that change, if we've allowed God to change us that way, then we're all the same. There's no, why would you be continuing to have him in this sort of I'm here and you're here type relationship? And so he's really encouraging him to go ahead and let him go. And all these encyclopedia articles and things on this book really talk it up on just how tactful Paul is, and he loves not using his authority. Right? I could as an apostle demand you to release him. I'm not going to do that. I'm asking you nicely type of thing. Yeah. And they really, so many people seem to just really appreciate just kind of how he writes this, and it's just so sort of beautiful and loving, and yet not presumptuous, like I'm gonna make you do this, and yet you can't read it and be like, of course Philemon is gonna release him. How could you not after reading a letter like this? And and of course it's beautiful to read. You read this and you just think, how did slavery ever exist within Christianity with a book like this in the scriptures? It's amazing, because it's just so clearly just rips any possible reasoning or justification you could have for that out from underneath you. So it's a beautiful little book. The authorship, it says it's signed by Paul. Paul says he wrote it. There's really no reason to think he didn't. And this is one of those where it doesn't have any of that controversy. The others, it's everyone really does agree. Yeah, this has got to be Paul writing this. And the dating. So interestingly, this is a great comparison to the other three. This one, he flat out says, I didn't even have to, because I read these books first, the books that I'm going over, I read them first, and then I go and read the encyclopedia articles and things. And I didn't even need to read any sources on this to go, wow, this has got to be a different imprisonment, because he says, I expect to be free soon. He tells them, he tells them to prepare a room for him. He's like, make sure, get my stuff ready. I'll be out of here pretty soon. And so the dating is earlier. We're talking like 61 to 62. It's earlier than the others because he's expecting to get out of there. It's not at all, like 2 Timothy, where he's like, I'm not gonna last here. So it's a totally different tone. So that's why it's a little bit earlier there. Just a couple interesting notes on Philemon. So there's some sources I read that said Onesimus, the slave, ran away and maybe even robbed Philemon. He sort of robbed him and ran away and somehow ended up with Paul while Paul's in prison. And then at that stage got saved or became Christian. Something happened there where Paul's now cherishes Onesimus. If that's so, if he did run away and rob his master, he could have been killed legally by Philemon. And Paul's saying, well, don't do that, and not even don't do that, but actually just release
Let
him,
him go. Yeah.
let him go. And some people think too that Paul, Philemon started to kind of serve Paul and sort of help him out with the ministry. Some people think that Philemon wanted, or some people think Paul wanted Philemon to send Onesimus back to keep helping him out because he just really, and I can kind of get that sense too. He's like, man, this guy's been a great help to me. So, make sure to keep that in mind. And interestingly enough, if you go and if you read Colossians, there's two guys at the end. He says, I'm sending these two guys with this letter to you Colossians. And the two guys he's sending with this letter is, one of them is Onesimus.
Mm.
And so I don't know how common that name was back then, but if I were to guess, I'd say it's probably the same Onesimus. And so I think, well, maybe that was the one and the same, and Philemon went ahead and let him go. So if we really wanted to get crazy, look back on our notes and see, well, when was Colossians written? So yeah, Colossians could have been written as late as 64, and with Philemon 61, 62, might have been our guy. So
Yeah.
it's kind of cool to see those connections. So that's it. That's all of Paul's letters to individuals. There you have it.
Cool.